In September 1964, Donald Strum, a welder and painter, went on a bow hunting trip with his friends to an area a little more than an hour northeast of Sacramento, California. Don was good at using a bow and arrow for hunting, and he preferred it to other weapons, which were prohibited at that time of year for hunting. Don, along with his friends Vincent Alvarez and Tim Trueblood, left Sacramento and headed towards Crisco Grove. Everyone was in a good mood and looking forward to their weekend hunt. Because they had no electronic communication devices, they stayed close enough to shout to each other. At one point, Don found himself on a ridge while his friends were below, prompting them to suggest he come down to where they were. On the way down, Don ventured too far away from them and got a bit lost. According to what he has said, at first it seemed like this was not a life-threatening situation for Don. He thought soon he would find his friends. However, as night fell, he realized he couldn't find his way back to the campsite. Although it was only a mile or two in a straight line, it requires traveling over rough terrain and some mountain peaks, making it difficult. As an experienced hunter, he knew he would not be safe to roam isolated areas, especially in the presence of potential predators such as bears, mountain lions, coyotes, and cougars. Don needed to find shelter to get through the night safely. He decided to climb a tree, which is what many hunters would do in a similar situation. The tree he found was not very big, but it was suitable. Even though the first branch was about 12 feet above the ground, he was still able to use the rocks on the cliff to climb up. The higher he climbed, the weaker the branches became, but he hoped that if anything happened to him, he would have a chance to defend himself until morning. John saw lights in the sky around 9 p.m. that seemed to go up and down as if someone was waving a flashlight, except it was above the tree line. Don thought his friends must have alerted the Forest Service, who sent a helicopter to look for him. Don knew he had to get help from the helicopter, so he climbed down the tree and used matches to light a signal fire on 3 large rocks about 10 feet apart from each other. The 3 fires would indicate that they were intentionally set and would be easier to see from a distance, especially with trees potentially obscuring the view of them. He waved his hands and shouted towards the light, afraid the pilots couldn't see the fire, as if the pilot could hear him from a distance over the sound of a helicopter engine and the whirling of the propeller. Finally, he caught the attention of the approaching aircraft. However, something seemed strange. The helicopter was heading towards at an unusually high speed without making any noise. The appearance was also confusing because it had a bright light in front, possibly landing lights or headlights, but seemed smaller than it should be. The aircraft was black and extreme darkness that almost absorbed light. At that time, it was difficult for him to determine the actual size of the plane because he could only see a small bright light in the sky. Don realized something was wrong and started to get scared. He is well aware of the possibilities of modern science, having worked on advanced rocket technology at work. He knew the object he witnessed that night was not of human origin. It was both too fast and silent, and appeared to be attracted to Don or the signal lights he had lit. Realizing he needed shelter, Don remembered the tree and decided to return there. He hoped that by hiding in the trees, he could avoid attracting further attention from whoever was controlling the mysterious object. When he reached the tree, Don threw his bow and arrow into it and began to climb. Although he knew that climbing the trees is not the best defense, it is still better than having no place to hide. Don, dressed in full camouflage, climbed up the tree, still hoping to go unnoticed in the dark branches. He wasn't entirely sure whether the object had detected him or not. The object looped around and got closer to Don, allowing him to observe it more closely. At this point, he noticed what he described as 3 windows on the side of the craft. The windows were staggered, arranged in a checkerboard pattern, not touching each other. Don realized that the entire vessel was up to 150 feet long. Windows themselves were not typical windows. They shined like tinfoil. Although Don could not clearly discern the general shape of the object, he noticed that something oval was obscuring the stars in the sky. The craft exhibits motion that defies laws of physics, traveling great distances silently and instantaneously without being affected by fluid dynamics. Don felt safe in the tree for a moment until a smaller ship appeared from between 3 windows that he called the cocoon. Don lost sight of it as it left the larger ship in the dark, but eventually he noticed it settled on a hill about a half-mile from him and parked in some bushes. Just then, Don heard the sound of something or several things moving through the dense bushes towards him, closer and closer. A creature emerged from the bushes, seemingly short and stocky, wearing a silver or white uniform or suit. The creature had a black gap on its face, but Don could not make out its large black round eyes that looked like welding glasses. Although the creatures appeared to be moving towards him, they also appeared to be easily distracted by their surroundings and curious, often stopping to study plants. Finally, the 2 creatures approached him. Without the need to say, Don was extremely frightened. Whatever was happening in front of him was not from this world. At this point, Don heard the creatures communicating with each other in a way that sounds like screeching of pigeons or the hooting of owls. He realized that they were probably receiving messages from the mothership because they did things after hearing the sound. Although they were initially distracted by their surroundings, more of them appeared, about 6 beings in total. Don wondered and hoped that was all they were doing, collecting samples and leaving. Then another being arrived, a larger creature with shining red eyes like a flashlight. Don calls it a robot and describes it as having metallic appearance with a large mouth and a hinged jaw. It moved mechanically and stopped under the tree where Don was hiding. The robot didn't seem to care about Don's light signal, so it used its hand to spread the ashes. Don sees the robot's hand in the light of the embers, describing it as resembling a medieval metal glove. Then the robot walked up to Don's tree, stood underneath it, then put his hand to his mouth, causing white steam to come out and rise through the tree trunk all the way to Don. Although the steam had no smell, it knocked Don unconscious. He slumped over, luckily not falling out of the tree. When he regained consciousness, he felt nauseous and began to vomit. The robot approached him and repeated the action that made him faint several times. Don interpreted this as an attack and decided he needed to act in self-defense. He aimed his bow at the robot. His arrow hit it in the middle of its chest, knocking it back several feet. This produced a bright light. The robot backed away about 10 to 20 feet, but eventually returned. Don fired his remaining arrows at the robot, with the same reaction every time. Don was exhausted. He wandered around the wilderness all day, got lost, and now he has to deal with this crap. He shot several arrows through things, shook trees. He was gassed multiple times, temporarily knocking him unconscious, though he hadn't slept. As dawn approached, Don noticed the faint signs of daylight and wondered how much longer he could endure as temperature dropped near freezing. Apparently, he burned most of his clothes to start the fire and was left with limited options. Now there were 2 robots standing under his tree face to face. He watched in amazement as beams of white light flashed between them, seemingly sharing information telepathically. Don was curious what they were doing. It seems at this point his fear was subdued. He was more intrigued. It turns out that they are gathering their strength to release more poisonous gas. This time colder and stronger. These robots are assholes. Just leave the guy alone. Don fell completely unconscious for a long time, but luckily he used a belt to tie himself to the tree so he didn't fall. When he finally woke up, he found himself alone, the sun finally rising. In the morning, Don found his way back to his friends and told them what happened. They were all understandably confused and scared and decided to leave. Wanting to learn more about what happened to him, Don contacted the Air Force and told them his story. They conducted an interview with Don. They thought it might have been a teenage prank. They took one of the arrows that had been bent after hitting the robot and sent it to the University of Colorado for analysis. 2 to 3 weeks after the encounter, Don returned to the scene of the incident with his little brother Bill and his friends. When they arrived, they discovered the area had been thoroughly searched. All traces of the encounter were gone, and they had found cigarette butts and tire tracks leading to the location. The ground was covered in rake marks. It seemed the Air Force was more interested in the location of the incident than they let Don know. On September 20th, 1977, a series of bright jellyfish-like flying objects were reported in the skies over Eastern Europe and Scandinavia. The objects of these objects vary widely from small, fast-moving balls of light that leave smoke trails to large, glowing jellyfish-like shapes. Reports from eyewitnesses, including medical personnel, military officials, sailors, airport staff, and amateur astronomers, described the luminous and brilliant object in the area. These objects were surrounded by elongated shells and emit specially shaped rays of light. The shells transferred and diffused over 10 to 15 minutes, while a more persistent and steady glow was observed. This phenomenon was observed by many people in different locations. An engineer reported seeing a glowing object in the settlement of Kirkajoki, which he initially thought was a meteor. He described the object as a hot air balloon and reported his sighting to a local institution of sciences who recorded it. Over time, the object stopped moving around that location and began to head in a different direction, increasing in size and taking on the characteristic shape of a spaceship. It was about 100 meters long and 12 to 15 meters in diameter, moving at an altitude of 300 to 500 meters. As the object approached the engineer, it ejected a glowing ball from behind that flew north, crashing behind a forest and creating a bright flash. He described the object as much larger than the moon and moving at the speed of a helicopter. The observation lasted about 10 to 15 minutes and took place in complete silence. A local philosopher also saw the object and wrote a detailed account. The object was shaped like a lens with a dim, translucent ring, dark amethyst in color and strongly illuminated from within. The edges of the object had 16 points, which he referred to as nozzles, which pulsated red. The object stopped, then changed direction, and flew off in a flight time of 15 minutes. The object was described as a giant star that appeared in the sky around 4 a.m. and emitted pulsing rays of light towards the Earth. It expanded and pulsated as it moved, but the brightness did not dull. After about 3 minutes, the object stopped and emitted a bright cloud that was round or oval in shape. The height of the object at the time of the cloud formation was estimated to be approximately 7 kilometers based on various observations. The object was red and emitted a bluish-white glow that illuminated the area like a full moon. A dark spot then formed around the core of the glowing cloud, which expanded as the light dimmed. The object hovered over the area for about 5 minutes before leaving. Its speed while hovering was similar to that of an airplane, while the whole phenomenon lasted about 15 minutes. And was also observed in neighboring areas. Eyewitness reports and preliminary data analysis conducted by the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1977 showed that the sightings are consistent and complementary. This phenomenon has been reported to have strange effects on people and the environment. Some eyewitnesses noticed that the air above the lake glowed with white light after the glowing yellow ball disappeared, and the glow was even brighter than the city lights. Areas where the phenomenon was observed also reported increased biological activity, such as flowering of roses and grasses, which were considered unusual for the area. Some engineers in the region reported massive failures of computer equipment during the phenomenon, which later returned to normal operation. Many explanations have been proposed to explain the phenomenon observed. At first, some experts thought that it was caused by a meteorite or the aurora borealis, but these explanations are questionable, as aurora borealis cannot occur at the height that the witnesses described, and it was proposed that the phenomenon was caused by several factors, including the launch of a satellite, magnetic disturbances caused by a solar flare, and a scientific experiment involving low-frequency radio waves in the ionosphere, possibly being debris from a launch vehicle or a satellite.